It was one of those afternoons that seemed too peaceful to be real. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the city streets. The air carried a faint scent of roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cafe, mixed with the distant smell of freshly baked bread from a small bakery on the corner. The hum of the city was calm, almost like it was taking a quiet breath before the evening rush. People were going about their lives without a care. A man in a blue shirt sat at an outdoor table sipping tea, his eyes lost in the screen of his phone. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they passed by, their sneakers squeaking against the pavement. A street musician sat on a low stool near the bus stop, plucking slow, soft notes from his guitar, filling the air with a melody so gentle it could almost make you forget the world's troubles. Across the street, the elderly woman walked slowly, her steps small and careful, as if each one was measured. Her hair was silver, tied neatly into a bun, and she carried a faded brown handbag that seemed almost as old as she was. Long, pale blue coat that fluttered slightly with the breeze. And each step she took seemed to hold years of stories, memories, and quiet strength. The street itself looked safe enough. Cars rolled past at a steady, lazy pace, and the traffic lights blinked in their usual rhythm. There was no sign, not even the smallest hint, that anything unusual was about to happen. It was the kind of afternoon where you'd expect to hear birds chirping and children laughing, not shouting or commotion. A couple stood near the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. The woman was holding a shopping bag filled with vegetables, the tops of fresh carrots poking out, their green leaves swaying. The man beside her tapped his foot impatiently, glancing at his watch as if the red traffic light was taking a little too long to turn green. The old woman reached the edge of the crosswalk. She looked both ways, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. She stepped onto the zebra stripes with the kind of caution that comes from a lifetime of crossing busy streets. Her handbag hung close to her body, and she clutched it a little tighter, not because she felt unsafe, but simply because old habits die hard. On the opposite side, two uniformed police officers were standing near a parked patrol car. They weren't in any hurry. One leaned against the car's door, arms crossed, while the other scrolled lazily on a phone. From a distance, they seemed like just another part of the city's quiet background. A gentle breeze passed through, carrying with it the sound of faint laughter from somewhere down the block. The sun glinted off shop windows, making little flashes of light dance across the street. A bus hissed as it pulled away from the curb, releasing a puff of exhaust that briefly filled the air before drifting upward. It should have been just another ordinary moment, the kind you'd walk past without remembering later. But in the span of seconds, the air seemed to shift. It was so subtle at first, a strange silence, as if even the city's background noises had paused for a breath. The street musician missed a note, his fingers stumbling for just a moment, and a faint tension crept into the air. The old woman was almost halfway across the street when the officers began moving toward her. At first, it didn't look like much. Maybe they were going to help her cross or ask her a simple question. But something about their pace felt different. It wasn't the relaxed walk of someone about to offer assistance. It was brisk, purposeful, and somehow heavy. A man sitting near the cafe glanced up from his coffee, his brows drawing together. He didn't know why, but something in his gut told him this scene was about to change. The light breeze now carried a different feeling, as if it knew trouble was brewing. The quietness of the afternoon began to feel less like peace and more like the calm before a storm. The old woman had made it past the halfway point of the crosswalk when the two officers' pace quickened. At first, the shift was small, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. But for those who noticed the man sipping coffee, the couple with the shopping bag, and even the street musician, there was something in that movement that didn't feel like friendly concern. The officer who had been leaning on the patrol car straightened up, his arms uncrossing in a sharp, deliberate motion. His eyes fixed on the woman with an intensity that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. The other officer slid his phone into his pocket and adjusted his belt, a movement so practiced, so casual, yet somehow brimming with readiness. Like a predator preparing to close in on prey. The old woman didn't notice. Eyes were on the ground in front of her, carefully scanning the uneven pavement as she stepped. Her shoes were worn at the edges, the leather softened from years of use. She had that kind of fragile steadiness. Slow but sure, with the occasional pause as if measuring each step. The officers stepped off the curb, their boots making a dull, heavy sound against the asphalt. Each step echoed louder than it should have. Or maybe it was just the way. The air seemed to grow still around them. The man at the cafe lowered his coffee cup and leaned forward. He squinted, trying to read the body language from across the street. Something in him whispered that this wasn't going to be just a routine interaction. The couple at the corner noticed too. The man with the shopping bag shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on the bag's handle. The woman beside him frowned, glancing at the officers. Then at the elderly woman who still seemed unaware of the attention she had drawn. The street musician kept playing, but his melody began to waver. His eyes, half hidden by his hair, followed the officer's movements while his fingers fumbled through a chord. It was as if the music was now just a thin background curtain, unable to mask the growing tension. When the officers reached the middle of the crosswalk, the taller one spoke first. His voice was deep and firm, carrying an edge that could slice through the calm. "Ma'am, stop right there," he called out. It wasn't loud enough to be a shout, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. The old woman looked up, startled. Her eyes blinked rapidly as she tried to understand why she was being addressed. She stopped mid-step, one foot still hovering slightly above the ground before she slowly placed it down. "Yes, officer?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The second officer stepped slightly to the side, flanking her position. It was a subtle move, but one that made her seem surrounded. The man at the cafe shifted in his chair, his heart starting to beat a little faster. People walking by slowed down, sensing something unusual. A young man with earbuds in one ear pulled one out to listen. A delivery driver paused at the curb, his eyes darting between the officers and the woman. The city's hum, moments ago so calm, now felt jagged. Like something sharp was hidden in the air. "We need to ask you some questions," the taller officer said, his tone more clipped now. The old woman frowned slightly, confusion clouding her features. She clutched her handbag a little tighter, not in fear, but as if holding on to something familiar would help her. Stay grounded in this strange moment. The second officer's hand brushed the radio clipped to his chest, his fingers lingering there. It was a small movement, but it caught the attention of a teenage boy who had stopped a few steps away. He pulled out his phone, raising it discreetly, camera ready. There was still no shouting, no physical contact, yet the air felt charged, as if the smallest spark could ignite something bigger. Every second seemed longer, stretched thin by anticipation. The crowd was watching now, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone could feel the shift. The calm of the afternoon was Fussy Sue's. With Humbly Sue's was equalated as a luxurious texture that glides on smoothly and leaves a rich, long-lasting color. Their expressions, a mix of fuck. Their expressions aren't ease, like a Wally Sissit. My missus? No one knew it's sift. Gone, replaced by something heavier. Something that made people's shoulders tense without realizing it. And in the midst of it all, the old woman stood still in the crosswalk. Sunlight spilling across her face, her silver hair catching the light. A fragile figure caught in the path of an approaching storm seemed to grow heavier. As the elderly woman stood frozen in the middle of the crosswalk, Her pale blue coat shifted slightly in the breeze, but everything else about her was still too still. The taller officer took another step forward, his boots striking the asphalt with a dull thud. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, as if the city itself had gone quiet just to listen. The woman's eyes moved between the two officers, confusion still painted across her wrinkled face. Is something wrong?" she asked softly, almost apologetically, as though she feared she might be in trouble without knowing why. The taller officer's reply was short, clipped, and impatient. "Ma'am, we told you to stop." He reached out with one hand, the movement sudden enough to make her flinch. His fingers closed around her arm. Not gently, not in a way that could be mistaken for guidance. It was firm, too firm for someone so frail. A collective murmur ran through the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was there, a ripple of disbelief. The man at the cafe sat up straighter, his coffee forgotten. The teenage boy's phone was now fully raised, its camera capturing everything. The old woman's handbag swung slightly as she tried to step back. "Please, I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling now. The second officer moved in quickly, circling to her other side. His hand shot out, gripping her other arm. This time, there was no mistaking the aggression, the way his fingers dug in, the way his posture leaned forward, dominating the space between them. She winced, her lips parting in a small cry that carried across the street. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, the kind of sound that sticks in your ears and makes your stomach twist. The first officer gave her a slight shove, just enough to make her take an unsteady step backward. Her shoe caught on a rough patch in the pavement, and she stumbled. The only thing keeping her from falling was the fact that they still held her arms. But even that seemed less like support and more like control. Gasps escaped from several onlookers. The woman with the shopping bag whispered something to the man beside her, her eyes wide. The street musician had stopped playing entirely, his guitar now resting silently against his chest. "Hey, what's going on here?" a man's voice called from somewhere in the small crowd. But it was swallowed quickly by the tension, as if even the people who wanted to speak up didn't quite know if they should. The taller officer's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, stop resisting," he said, in that authoritative tone, the one designed to make bystanders assume guilt. "I'm not resisting, please." The old woman cried, her voice cracking like thin glass. The second officer tugged at her arm to pull her toward the curb. The movement was rough enough to make her handbag slip off her shoulder and fall to the ground with a dull thump. Its clasp burst open, and the contents, a small coin purse, a folded handkerchief, and a few papers spilled out onto the street. No one bent down to pick them up. All eyes were on the officers now. The teenage boy recording took a cautious step forward, angling his phone to make sure he caught both the officers' faces and the woman's distressed expression. "Let her go." Another voice from the crowd called out, this time louder, braver. But the officers didn't let go. In fact, their grips seemed to tighten. The old woman's shoulders slumped forward under the pressure, and her knees bent slightly as though her body was struggling to keep up with their force. It was at that moment that the situation truly shifted from uncomfortable to explosive. The taller officer, perhaps frustrated by her pleas or the growing crowd, shoved her again, harder this time. She stumbled once more, her foot sliding on the painted white stripes of the crosswalk. She nearly lost her balance completely, but the second officer's grip yanked her upright. The movement was so abrupt that her glasses slipped down her nose. She pushed them up with a trembling hand, still looking utterly confused, still pleading. The crowd's murmurs turned into open outrage now. "Hey, she's an old lady," someone shouted. A woman near the cafe had her phone out too. Filming from a different angle, the street musician had placed his guitar back into its case. his expression hardening as he stood. 'Twas clear he was no longer a passive observer. The elderly woman's voice shook again, barely holding together. "Please, I didn't do anything." But the officers kept their positions, bodies squared, their hands gripping her like she was a threat. And that was the moment, the exact second, when the peaceful afternoon truly shattered, and the tension in the air became something undeniable. Somewhere nearby, a shadow began to move quickly toward the scene, a shadow that belonged to a man whose name the world knew well. Just a few doors down from the crosswalk, Mike Tyson had been enjoying a rare, quiet afternoon. The cafe he sat in was small, tucked between a vintage clothing store and an old bookstore whose windows were crowded with second-hand novels. Tyson sat near the front window, a half-finished cappuccino in front of him. His massive hands dwarfed the delicate porcelain cup. The soft jazz track played quietly through the cafe speakers. Mike had been lost in thought, watching the sunlight spill across the street outside. He'd been nodding politely at the occasional fan who passed by, giving them that warm, surprisingly gentle smile that made people forget about the ferocious fighter he once was in the ring. The world outside looked hit. Normal enough until he heard it. It wasn't a loud noise at first, just a faint shift in tone from the background city sounds. The laughter of teenagers had gone quiet. The soft hum of traffic seemed interrupted. Then came a small, sharp cry, a woman's voice, strained and trembling. Mike's head turned immediately toward the sound. Years of fighting had sharpened. His instincts could feel tension before he even fully saw it. His eyes locked on the crosswalk. There she was, the old woman, frail and confused, trapped between two police officers. Even from where he sat, Tyson could see the way they gripped her arms. It wasn't the way you held someone to help them. It was control. Force. He leaned forward in his chair, his muscles tightening, his brow furrowed, and for a brief moment, the warm smile he'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by the focused, sharp-eyed expression people remembered from his fighting days. The cafe's chatter faded from his awareness. The clinking of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, all of it became background noise. His attention was locked on that crosswalk. He saw her handbag on the ground, its contents scattered like a snapshot of a quiet life: coins, papers, and a neatly folded handkerchief. He noticed her glasses slipping on her nose, her lips forming pleas that seemed to go unheard. The taller officer shoved her again, and Tyson's jaw tightened. His right hand curled into a loose fist on the table, a habit he'd never fully unlearned. "Mike, you all right?" The cafe's barista asked softly, noticing the change in his expression. Tyson didn't answer. His eyes never left the scene. He pushed back his chair slowly, deliberately, and stood. The cafe felt smaller all of a sudden, the space around him shrinking as he made his way toward the door. Outside, the air was brighter, sharper. The sunlight caught on the gold chain around his neck as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He began walking toward the crosswalk, his pace steady but purposeful as he closed the distance. He started to pick up more details, the murmurs of the crowd, the shifting of bodies as bystanders stepped closer, phones raised. He heard the second officer's voice, clipped and cold. "Stop resisting." He saw the woman's face up close now, the lines of age, the worry etched deeply, the confusion in her eyes. He saw the way her shoulders hunched forward under their grip, like she was trying to make herself smaller, less of a target. Tyson's pace quickened. He wasn't running, but each step carried more weight, more intent. People in the crowd began to notice him. A few whispered, recognizing him instantly. The teenage boy recording widened his eyes, the phone's camera now catching a heavyweight legend moving straight toward the confrontation. The officers hadn't seen him yet. They were too focused on their grip, their orders, their dominance, over a woman who couldn't fight back, Mike's shadow stretched ahead of him on the sunlit pavement, crossing the white stripes of the crosswalk like a signal. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back gasped. The distance closed with each step, the space between Tyson and the officers shrinking until there would be no more room for inaction. And just before he reached them, the atmosphere shifted again, the calm before the storm. Tension now replaced by the heavy, unspoken knowledge that something was about to change. Mike Tyson reached the edge of the crowd, but he didn't stop. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around for permission. His steps were steady, deliberate, the kind of walk that made people instinctively move aside. It wasn't aggression, it was presence. A presence so strong that the air seemed to shift with it. The crowd parted without a word, their eyes fixed on him. Some knew exactly who he was. Others recognized only the unmistakable energy of someone who wasn't there to watch, but to act. A man in the back muttered, "That's Mike Tyson." And the words traveled through the crowd like a current. The teenage boy filming lowered his phone for a split second, as if even he was surprised by what he was recording. Then, realizing the gravity of the moment, he raised it again, his hands trembling slightly. Tyson stepped onto the crosswalk. The officers still had their hands on the old woman. She was pleading, her voice cracking. "Please, I haven't done anything." The taller officer ignored her words, his focus on keeping her in place. As if she were a criminal caught mid-crime, Tyson's shadow fell over them before they even noticed him. The taller officer glanced up, ready to dismiss whoever it was. But then his eyes landed on Tyson's face. His expression faltered, just for a moment, but enough for anyone paying attention to see it. Mike didn't yell. He didn't rush. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but heavy. The kind of calm that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Let her go," he said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command in the usual sense. It was a statement, a fact, spoken as if there were no other possible outcome. The second officer frowned, tightening his grip on the woman's arm as if to challenge the intrusion. "Sir, this is a police matter." Tyson took one step closer. He was close enough now that the sunlight caught the edge of his face, and the sheer size of him compared to the officers was undeniable. Years of training, of fighting, of discipline, they were all still there, even in his relaxed stance. "I said," Tyson repeated slowly, "let her go." The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the street musician, who had set his guitar aside earlier, was standing still, his eyes locked on the scene. It was the kind of silence that made every sound sharper, the distant honk of a car, the faint rustle of paper as a breeze shifted the old woman's fallen belongings on the pavement. The taller officer hesitated. His grip loosened slightly, but not enough to release her. His pride was caught in the moment, tangled between authority and the sudden realization of who was standing in front of him. The old woman, her face still etched with confusion, looked up at Tyson. For the first time since the officers had stopped, her eyes held something other than fear. It was small, fragile, but it was hope. Tyson lowered his gaze to her for a brief second, then returned his focus to the officers. His voice dropped even lower, but somehow it carried further, as if every person in the crowd could hear him clearly. "You're holding a grandmother in the middle of the street," he said. "Look at her. She's scared, she's hurt, and she's done nothing to you." There was no dramatic gesture, no raised fists, but the authority in his tone was heavier than any punch. The crowd began to murmur again, louder this time. "Let her go," someone shouted from the back, and another voice joined in. The tension in the air shifted. Now it wasn't just Tyson against the officers. It was Tyson with the crowd behind him. The second officer glanced at the growing group of people at the phones recording from multiple angles. He shifted uncomfortably. The taller officer's jaw worked as if he were chewing on the decision. Tyson took one more step forward. Now there was barely a foot of space between him. And the officer's eyes never blinked, never shifted away from theirs. It wasn't anger in his gaze, it was something deeper. Something that told them this was the wrong hill to die on. The old woman's arm twitched as if she wanted to pull away, but didn't have the strength. Tyson noticed and tilted his head slightly toward her. "It's okay, ma'am. I'm here now." Those words, simple as they were, carried enough reassurance to soften her trembling. She nodded faintly, her lips pressing together as she tried to steady herself. The taller officer finally exhaled, and his grip loosened further. The second officer followed suit. Their hands dropped from her arms slowly, like they were letting go of a live wire. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. But Tyson didn't react to it. His focus was still on the woman, bending slightly to help her steady her balance. He reached down, picked up her handbag, and gently handed it back to her. "You're safe now," he said quietly. The officers stood there, their authority suddenly fragile under the weight of what had just happened and the knowledge that dozens of cameras had captured every second. Tyson straightened up, his presence still towering, still commanding. And without raising his voice, without throwing a single punch, he had shifted the entire balance of the moment. The moment the officers released their grip, it was as if the city itself took a breath. But the air was still heavy, thick, with something that felt unstable, like a storm cloud hovering just overhead. The crowd's reaction was immediate, but not uniform. Some people clapped and cheered, their voices loud with approval. Others stayed quiet, their eyes darting between Tyson, the officers, and the old woman, unsure if the situation was truly over or just pausing before something worse. The taller officer stepped back half a pace, but his jaw was still tight, the muscle along the side twitching. He didn't like the loss of control. He didn't like the eyes on him. And he definitely didn't like the fact that his authority had just been undercut, not by another officer, not by a superior, but by a civilian. The second officer adjusted his belt and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Moved over the crowd, lingering on the raised phones. There were at least a dozen people filming now, some openly, some pretending to scroll while their cameras recorded every angle. He knew what that meant. This wouldn't stay on this street. It wouldn't end here. By tonight, it would be online. By morning, it would be everywhere. The old woman stood with her handbag clutched to her chest, her shoulders still tense. She didn't move yet. Maybe she was afraid the officers would grab her again if she tried to walk away. Tyson stayed close to her, his body angled slightly between her and the officers, not in an aggressive stance, but in one that made his role clear. Protector, shield. The murmurs in the crowd began to shift. They weren't just talking about the officers anymore. Now they were talking about Tyson. That's really Mike Tyson. He just stepped in like it was nothing. Man, he didn't even have to raise a hand. Tyson didn't acknowledge the comments. His eyes stayed on the officers, his expression calm but unshakable. He wasn't there for attention. He wasn't there for applause. He was there because what he saw wasn't right. And for him, that was reason enough. The taller officer finally spoke, his voice sharper than before, as if he was trying to regain ground. "Sir, we have this under control. You don't need to involve yourself." Tyson didn't blink. "You had control," he said slowly. But it wasn't the right kind of control. The words hung in the air. They weren't shouted, but they cut clean through the noise around them. A few people in the crowd murmured in agreement, some even nodding. The second officer glanced at his partner, then at Tyson, then at the crowd again. His shoulders shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes. Someone in the back shouted, "We saw everything." Another voice joined in, "Yeah, we've got it all on video." That ripple of voices spread like a wave until there was a low chorus of people confirming they'd witnessed the whole thing. The tension between the two officers was visible now. The taller one seemed to want to push back, to assert himself again, while the second looked like he just wanted to leave before the situation got worse. Tyson took a small step forward, closing the gap just enough that the taller officer had to tilt his chin slightly upward to meet his eyes. Tyson's voice stayed low, but it carried with an authority that didn't need a badge. "You're done here," he said simply. The old woman glanced up at Tyson, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, maybe thank him, maybe tell him she could walk now. But the moment was still too charged, too dangerous to break with casual words. The crowd seemed to sense that the next few seconds could decide whether this ended cleanly or turned into something explosive. People held their breath without realizing it. The taller officer looked like he was on the edge of saying something else, but then a voice crackled from the radio on his shoulder. Static, followed by a calm dispatcher's tone, calling them to another location. He hesitated, looked at the woman, looked at Tyson, looked at the crowd. Then, without another word, he turned toward the patrol car. His partner followed, casting one last uneasy glance at the cameras pointed their way. The crowd didn't cheer this time. They just watched as the officers got into the car and pulled away, the sound of the engine fading into the background hum of the city. Tyson turned to the old woman, his expression softening instantly. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you somewhere safe." She nodded, the tension in her face easing for the first time since the whole thing began. And though the confrontation had ended, the energy in the air still buzzed. The kind of buzz that comes when people know they've just witnessed something that will be talked about for a long time. The patrol car's engine faded into the distance, swallowed by the hum of the city. But the silence it left behind was almost louder than the confrontation itself. It wasn't the empty silence of before. It was full, charged, like the aftershock of a powerful earthquake. People were still standing where they had been moments ago, phones still in their hands, eyes still wide. They had seen something raw, something real, and they knew it would stay with them. The old woman stood in the same spot for a few seconds longer, as if her body wasn't sure it could trust the calm. Her fingers clung tightly to the handle of her faded handbag, knuckles pale from the grip. Her breathing was quick and shallow, her chest rising and falling in little bursts, like her body was trying to catch up after the fear. Tyson stayed close, not rushing her. His presence was steady, solid, like an anchor in shifting waters. He didn't touch her without permission, but his posture made it clear he was there to protect her until she decided she was ready to move. "It's okay now," he said softly, his voice almost gentle enough to be lost in the breeze. "They're gone." Her eyes lifted to meet his. Up close, the lines on her face told a lifetime's worth of stories. Joy, hardship, love, loss, all the ordinary and extraordinary things that shape a person over decades. But in that moment, the most visible thing in her gaze was gratitude. Not the casual kind you give to someone who holds open a door, but the deep, unshakable kind that comes from knowing someone stood between you and harm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words trembling out as if they'd been waiting at the edge of her lips. Tyson gave her a small nod, his eyes warm. "You don't have to thank me. You didn't deserve that. Nobody does." He bent down to pick up the rest of her belongings. The little handkerchief had blown a few feet away, caught on the edge of the curb. He retrieved it carefully, folded it back into the shape she'd kept it in, and placed it inside her bag along with her scattered papers. It was such a simple action, but the way he did it, slow, deliberate, respectful, made it feel like more than just tidying up. It was giving her back a piece of her dignity. The crowd had begun to loosen. Some people walked away, murmuring to each other about what they'd just witnessed. Others stayed, reluctant to leave, as if the scene still held them in its grip. A young woman with a phone lowered it and called out, "Ma'am, do you need us to call someone for you?" The old woman shook her head gently. "No, dear. I can manage now." But Tyson didn't seem convinced. "Do you live nearby?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "A few blocks from here. Then I'll walk you home," Tyson said simply. It wasn't a suggestion. And it wasn't controlling. It was the kind of statement that made it clear. He wasn't about to let her walk alone after what had just happened. She hesitated for a moment, maybe worried about troubling him, but then she gave the smallest smile. "All right." They began to walk, side by side, moving slowly toward the corner. Tyson adjusted his pace to match hers, his massive frame moving at the same measured steps she took. Each step away from the crosswalk seemed to pull a little more weight from her shoulders. Behind them, a few people still filmed, capturing not just the confrontation, but the quieter moment after. The part where the hero doesn't just stop the danger, but makes sure the person is truly safe afterward. One of the teenagers muttered to his friend, "Man, that's how you know it's real." He didn't just swoop in for the cameras. He stayed. As they turned the corner, the street seemed to return to its regular rhythm. Cars passed, people chatted. The street musician picked up his guitar again. But for those who had been there, the ordinary day was no longer just ordinary. They had seen a moment that proved something rare, that sometimes the right person shows up at the exact moment they're needed and stays until the very end. For the old woman, the memory of fear would fade eventually. But the memory of the man who stepped in, stood tall, and walked her home, that would last forever. By the time Tyson and the elderly woman reached her small apartment building, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. The city had slipped back into its usual rhythm, cars honking in the distance, shop doors opening and closing, the smell of food drifting from a nearby restaurant. But on that street corner where it all began, the ripples of what happened were already spreading far beyond anyone's view, while Tyson had been walking the woman home. Videos from the scene were already racing through the internet, the teenage boys recording the one that caught every second. From the officer's grip on the woman to Tyson's quiet, commanding intervention was uploaded to social media within minutes. The title was simple but powerful. Mike Tyson saves elderly woman from police assault. The video was less than 2 minutes long, but it didn't need to be longer. Every frame told a story: the woman's fear, the officer's aggression, the moment Tyson stepped in, the way the crowd shifted behind him, and then the release, the officer's letting go, the woman free. It spread like wildfire. Within an hour, it had thousands of shares. By the second hour, it had reached hundreds of thousands of views across multiple platforms. People began adding captions, hashtags, and commentary. A real-life hero. This is why people love Mike Tyson. Not just a fighter in the ring, but a fighter for what's right. Respect. 100% respect. News outlets caught wind of it almost instantly. Online articles popped up. Mike Tyson intervenes in police confrontation with elderly woman. From boxing legend to street hero, Tyson protects grandmother from harassment. By evening, TV news anchors were replaying the clip in slow motion. Analysts discussed the incident, some focusing on police conduct, others on Tyson's calm but unshakable presence. Photos of him standing protectively beside the woman became the image of the day. Printed in headlines worldwide, in living rooms across the country. Families watched the clip together. Some cheered. Some shook their heads in disbelief. And some, especially older viewers, felt a lump in their throat, seeing someone who could have been their own mother or grandmother treated so roughly, and saved by a man they'd once watched fight in world championship bouts. Meanwhile, The woman herself sat quietly in her small living room. Her apartment smelled faintly of lavender, and the evening light spilled gently across her floral curtains. Tyson sat in the armchair opposite her, sipping the tea she'd insisted on making. They weren't talking about the cameras or the headlines. They weren't talking about the fact that, at that very moment, their faces were on millions of screens. They were talking about her late husband, about her children who lived in another city, about the neighborhood she'd called home for over 30 years. For Tyson, it wasn't about the fame or the attention or even the praise. It was about the fact that when he saw something wrong, he stepped in and he stayed until he knew the person was okay. That was it. But outside that room, the story had taken on a life of its own. Fans flooded his social media with messages of admiration. Strangers shared the video with captions like, "This is how you use your strength, and more people like this, please." And in countless comment sections, people were debating, questioning, praising, and learning from what they'd seen. It wasn't just a viral clip anymore. It had become a conversation about courage, about humanity, about how much one person's actions can shift the course of a moment. By midnight, the video had millions of views. By the next morning, it had reached newsrooms in other countries. And within days, it wasn't just a local incident, it was an international story. Somewhere, in that quiet little apartment, the old woman probably didn't realize just how far her story had traveled. But for everyone who had seen it, the image was burned in their minds. An aging champion standing tall in the middle of a city street. Not with fists raised for a fight, but with a presence so strong it made the world stop and listen. And that, more than anything, was why people were calling him not just a fighter, but a hero. The ripple effect days turned into weeks, but the story refused to fade. What had started as a tense street confrontation had transformed into something bigger. A symbol, the video was no longer just trending. It had entered the cultural bloodstream. It was playing on televisions and barbershops, being discussed in classrooms, shown in social media compilations about real-life heroes. People didn't just watch it, they felt it. They analyzed Tyson's calm stance, the way he never raised his voice, the way he physically placed himself between danger and the defenseless. Hashtags like hashtag stand up like Tyson and hashtag be the shield began to trend, attached to posts where people shared their own stories of stepping in to protect others. Some were small moments, someone defending a bullied student in a hallway, a stranger stopping to help a struggling mother at a grocery store. Others were bigger witnesses intervening in public disputes to de-escalate tensions. Actions had become a blueprint for bravery. Meanwhile, the elderly woman, her name now revealed as Margaret Ellis, found herself receiving letters from strangers across the country. Some wrote to share their anger at how she was treated. Others simply sent warm wishes, hoping she was healing both physically and emotionally. Local stores in her neighborhood began greeting her differently, with an extra level of kindness. People she didn't even know would stop her to ask, "Are you the lady Mike Tyson helped?" Margaret remained humble. She didn't seek interviews or try to become a public figure. When she did speak, her message was simple. "I'm grateful for what Mike did, but I hope people understand, we shouldn't need a famous man to step in before we do what's right for one another." Tyson himself stayed out of the spotlight for a few days, but it was impossible to avoid the flood of gratitude pouring his way. In one rare interview, he shrugged off the hero label. "I didn't think about cameras or headlines," he said. "I just saw a situation that was wrong, and I couldn't walk past it." That's not about being a hero. That's about being human. The interviewer pressed him, asking if he was aware how much of an impact his presence had. Tyson's response was as simple as it was powerful. "If you've got strength, you use it to protect. That's the rule." Behind the scenes, the video had sparked discussions in police departments about how officers handle vulnerable individuals. It even became part of a debate on de-escalation training, shared in workshops as a case study, not because Tyson was famous, but because the incident showed the importance of public accountability. For Margaret, the lasting change wasn't in news coverage or social media posts. It was in the way she carried herself afterward. Fear had taken something from her that day, but Tyson's intervention had given her something back, a reminder that, even in moments of powerlessness, there are still people willing to stand up. One crisp morning, a few weeks later, she found herself back at the same intersection where it had all happened. The crosswalk looked the same. The painted white lines, the hum of traffic, the faint smell of coffee from the nearby cafe. But it felt different. The memories were still there, but so was the knowledge that on that spot, in her moment of fear, someone had stepped in and changed the ending. And somewhere else in the city, Mike Tyson was going about his day, not chasing the next fight or the next headline, but living by the same principle he always had. That strength isn't just about what you can do with your fists. It's about what you choose to do with your heart. The world would eventually move on to the next story, the next viral clip. But for those who had seen it, and for the two people at the center of it, the moment would never truly fade. It would remain a quiet reminder that in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground and say, enough. The legacy lives on. Months had passed since that afternoon at the crosswalk, yet the memory refused to fade. The world had moved through 100 different headlines, but this one still lingered. Not because of its shock value, but because of the rare purity at its core. Mike Tyson had gone back to his life, but wherever he went, the echoes of that day seemed to follow. People stopped him in airports, in grocery stores, even while he was jogging in the park. They didn't just ask for autographs or selfies anymore. They thanked him. And they didn't thank him for his fights, or his belts, or his career. They thanked him for reminding them that courage could be quiet, that it didn't have to come with shouting or spectacle. Margaret Ellis, too, had settled back into her routines. Her days were filled with small rituals, watering her plants, talking to her neighbors, visiting the little corner shop for fresh bread in the mornings. But there was a difference now. Where once she might have hurried down the street with her eyes low, she now walked at a gentler, steadier pace, unafraid to meet the gaze of those who passed. Every so often, a stranger would stop her. "You're the lady from the video, aren't you?" At first, she would smile politely and nod, unsure how to respond. But over time, she learned to meet their admiration with something deeper than a smile. She would say, "Yes, but it's not about me. It's about how we should all treat each other." The video continued to surface unexpectedly in school assemblies, in workplace training seminars, and documentaries about social responsibility. It was no longer just that clip of Mike Tyson saving an old woman. It had become an example, a case study in human decency under pressure. Teachers used it to spark discussions about ethics. Parents used it to talk to their children about bravery and kindness. Even more surprising were the letters and messages that reached Tyson from people who said they'd been inspired to act differently in their own lives. One came from a young man in another country who wrote, "I saw what you did, and last week, when I saw a man yelling at a child in the street, I stepped in. I wouldn't have done it before, but I thought if Mike Tyson can stand up for a stranger, so can I." Tyson read messages like that quietly, without fanfare. He didn't post them online, he didn't seek credit, but they mattered to him. They reminded him that his influence, the real kind, not the celebrity kind, reached further than he ever imagined. The day eventually came when Tyson and Margaret crossed paths again. It wasn't planned. They met in the same cafe, where Tyson had been sitting that afternoon, the air still smelling faintly of roasted coffee beans. Margaret had come in for tea. Tyson had stopped in for his usual cappuccino. When they saw each other, their faces lit up instantly. They sat together at a small table near the window. talking about everything except that day, her grandkids, his pigeons, the weather, the little joys and frustrations of daily life. Yet, even without mentioning it, the memory was there between them, unspoken but strong. Outside, the world went about its business. Cars rolled past. People hurried to appointments. The street musician played his guitar in front of the bus. Stop. But for the two of them, the city would always carry a shadow of that afternoon. A reminder that they had shared a moment that neither time nor distance could erase. And somewhere, in places they'd never see, people still watched the video. For the first time. Some would scroll past after a glance, but others would stop. They would watch closely, and they would feel something stir inside them, something that might one day push them to step forward in their own moment of choice. That was the true legacy, not the fame, not the headlines, not the millions of views. The legacy was in the quiet, invisible chain reaction, one act of courage inspiring another. Again and again, long after the original moment had passed. Because heroes don't always live in the past tense. Sometimes their actions keep living, shaping the choices of people they will never meet. And for Mike Tyson and Margaret Ellis, that was more than enough.